Hi, hello, and welcome to Rebel Unicorn Crafts. Today, I'm going to be giving you my first impressions of the Masterson Sta-Wet Palette. I had to buy this for a class that I'm taking online, and I was really curious. Usually I just use a glass palette, and I can explain that at another time if anybody is interested. But this is me checking out this palette and telling you what I think about it, if it's worth the money, if it's easy to use, that type of thing. So my first impressions of this were quite honestly a little bit low because one, I don't like change, and two, the packaging of this was pretty underwhelming. But this was the recommended one, and it seems to kind of be the main one available. I bought mine from Blick. From Blick Art Supplies, and it was the only Stay Wet palette that I saw on there. It was also the recommended one for me, and I bought mine as just kind of the base one, and I believe it cost me about $11, $11.75, I think. I did also do a quick search on Amazon to see what other wet palettes are out there, and there are a few other options. There's not a ton though. I really only saw about four other options to purchase, and they were all a little more expensive, so I'm gonna go with the one that was recommended. Alright, so I did read the instructions for this, and this is kind of a plastic box, so it has a lid. It's not super airtight, but it fits pretty well. Then there is this piece of sponge with two different sides. One's got a textured side and one has a smooth side. And then it has 5 of these sheets of paper that we're actually going to be soaking and using to put our paints on. And at first I was like, oh, only 5, that's not very many. But I later read in the instructions you can actually wash these and reuse them, so I'll be showing you that as well. So 5 will actually get you a lot further than you think they will. In order to use this, you do need to do a little bit of prep, and the simplified instructions for that are you're going to take one of those sheets of paper and you're going to soak it in as hot of water as your tap can get for about 15 minutes, and then you're going to rinse and saturate the sponge with cold water. So welcome to my very messy art sink, and our hot water does get pretty hot because we've got it set a little bit higher. I'm going to actually soak this paper because I don't want to put it in my really messy sink. I'm going to soak it right in the palette, and I just put that hot water in there and I'm going to let it sit for 15 minutes. Then I'm taking the sponge, and there is kind of a coating, they say, so you want to really rinse it out with that cool water, and then you want to actually squeeze it out so it's about 50% saturated. Alright, my paper has been soaking for the 15 minutes, and putting it in the basin, it obviously fits, but it's really difficult to get out. So if you have a sink that's not as dirty as mine, maybe consider soaking it in there. I was worried about trying to pull this out because obviously soaking paper typically makes it flimsy and terrible, but this paper is some pretty tough stuff, and it just seems to get pliable. It's pretty interesting paper. Following the instructions, I put the sponge smooth side up in and then put my paper on it. Now that we've prepped it, it's time to actually try to use them. For this class, I am using golden fluid acrylics, and these are a higher priced paint, so if this palette can extend the usability of these, it's going to mean a huge amount of saving paint, and I'm really curious to find out what happens. Alright, so as you can see, I've got obviously still quite a lot of water on there, so when I put my paint on initially, it kind of spread out a bit, and I think I just oversaturated this. Alright, so I am a little skeptical to see how well this works to keep these things from drying out. It is acrylic paint, which dries out pretty fast, so I put a timer on my phone, and a little out of frame here, but I am putting a few drops of the same colors on my glass palette that I already put on my wet palette, and then I'm going to be working on the painting I'm using for class, And I'm going to be checking in periodically to see how wet my wet palette ones stay and how dry or wet my glass palette ones stay. Here's my project I'm going to be working on. For this, in this class, I was supposed to paint something or make something that symbolized exploration, transformation, and imagination. So this is little Moogie on a space exploration trip to a crystal planet, and it's kind of inspired by art and things like that. So there are some paint brushes. It's going to be on a little rainbow train track. I put a little extra of the colors I wanted to use to mix my colors on my Sta-Wet palette because I wanted to keep a little glob on for the testing to see, because I knew I was going to be using the colors. And I'm going for kind of this space color where it's going to be this kind of slightly muted blue. So I'm taking a little bit of the orange and some of the blue, and I am mixing in a little bit of white because there's going to be a sun in the upper right hand corner. So it's going to be lighter on the right side and darker on the left side. So I'm going to paint, and let's check in a few minutes to see how wet or dry my colors are on both palettes. At this point in the painting, I wasn't super liking the lack of control I could actually have on the wet palette, because the color you mix stays there, so it's really hard to lighten it or without taking up a whole new space. So I actually for a while just kind of switched back to using my glass palette because it's what I am used to using. And then I had to kick myself in the butt and say, no, go back to testing the other one. We've got to get used to it. About 15 minutes in, I was still a little bit struggling with the Sta-Wet palette and wasn't super excited about it, but I was getting more used to it. So we're at 15 minutes. Let's do a check at how wet things are. And things on my glass palette are still pretty wet, and obviously things on my Sta-Wet palette are still quite wet because I'm using it. This isn't super surprising. I can typically work with colors on the glass palette for at least 15 minutes or so. At the 24-minute mark, a few things did change a little bit. So on my wet palette, everything was still wet, but on my dry palette, even though those blobs of paint were still wet, the areas that I had mixed and they were really thin on the palette had dried out. So I wasn't able to use that paint that I had mixed up there. So this is the first sign that maybe I'm kind of liking the Sta-Wet palette. I checked on these probably every 10 minutes or so, and spoiler alert, things stay pretty wet. I did think that the palette was drying out a little bit, and I think I did this prematurely, but I did see in there that you could just spray the sponge a bit, so I sprayed the sponge just to make sure everything stayed, the appropriate color. And I do think it's interesting that it's bled into the sponge, and it looks like it's bled through the paper, but it also hasn't. I don't understand. At about 41 minutes, when I observed my paint on my glass palette, it was still workable, but I was getting a bit of a film on the outside, so you would have to kind of poke it to actually get the usable part of the paint. So I think about here is the threshold of where this paint stops becoming super usable on the glass palette, whereas on the Sta palette, it was still fresh and wet. At about the hour mark, I did have to throw in the towel with the glass palette. Ones because the paint was basically unusable. It was mainly skin. They weren't hard. You could have gotten some pigment out of there, but they were pretty much dry all the way on the outsides other than the very center. So that's the extent of what I could have used of that paint pretty much, whereas I'm still plugging away over here on the wet palette, and those original 3 dabs of paint. At this point, I've actually started using them because I just don't want to waste any more paint, and they are 100% staying wet. So I'm starting to, at this point, get a little more impressed. It's difficult for me to use because I'm not used to it, and it can kind of water down the paints, but I'm starting to like it. I finished up my background using this palette, and then I wanted to see about cleanup or reuse, because that's the big advantage I see to using my glass palette. It's super easy to clean up. All I typically need to do is take a spray bottle and spray it a bit, and then I use an X-Acto blade to just scrape it off, and it's almost like brand new. Whereas this one, it said that it is washable, and before I started another project on this piece of paper, I would want to wash this off. The paint on there is usable, but if I were using something in a completely different color palette, that blue is going to be everywhere, and I'm not going to have very much workable space for mixing and using the palette, so I need to clean this off. So let's head back to the very messy art sink. The instructions clearly say that there will be staining on the paper, and that shouldn't actually affect it. If you let it dry completely on there, you can work directly on it, or you can wash it off. And even though it'll be stained, it shouldn't impact your ability to do it. So I've never washed paper, and this was an interesting experience. But I washed this off, and I got all the pigment off of it, and it didn't tear. It didn't even feel like it really was going to. It is really stained, so it's going to be a little harder to see. I also washed out the sponge here, and let's see if it works a second time. And sure enough, that it works with a different type of paint. I'm using a different acrylic paint here that I think is going to stick better to this glass project I'm using. The more I use this, the more impressed I get. So, let's go through some of the pros and cons. Okay, pro, your paint stays wet. I will say that after this initial test, I've been using this throughout the week, and I've had globs of acrylic paint stay fresh and usable for about 3 days. I usually use it by the time that end of that 3 days goes, but it's like as if I just put it on the palette. And haven't even been too diligent about refreshing that sponge. It's just sitting there with the cover on. So that's pretty impressive. A con is I don't like that I can't easily get a white surface to mix on, so it's a little harder to tell what color I'm using. It also, another con would be, it doesn't seem super great for using a palette knife, so you have to really saturate a brush. And I don't always like having my brushes filled to the brim with paint, because I think it gets in there and kind of ruins them. So that's not my favorite. But I do like when I'm mixing for gradients and things like that, this seems to help because it keeps so much of that on your palette, so you can do some subtle transitions. Another pro, I thought that this was not going to be a super eco-conscious option because you had to throw paper away constantly, but I honestly don't see when I'm going to need to change this single piece of paper, so those 5 sheets should last me a really long time. Another pro is you could travel with this paint, put a rubber band around it, and you've got a fresh palette of paint that you could use. One con would be just the preparation. If you're too impatient, you do need to wait about 15 minutes to use this, and that's going to be a little difficult. Overall, although I think I'm going to recommend this, if you are looking for a paint palette solution, definitely consider the Masterson's Sta-Wet Palette. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a magically creative day. If you want to check out other videos on my channel, I have other art supply testing videos. If you want to check out my art, follow at Lacey Walker Art. If you want to see more behind the scenes testing, follow at Rebel Unicorn Crafts on Instagram. And I now have some stuff up in my Etsy shop on both my Lacey Walker Art and my Rebel Unicorn Crafts shop. Check it out.